Alright, today we got a video on Mr. Casey, America and the Cold War to present. So I've got a lot to do. We're going to try to hit it from the American perspective. I'm going to dabble with a little bit of global, but we'll get it done. So here we go. So when we start, we've got to know two things. The Marshall Plan is going to get us heavily involved in the Cold War. And I'm talking about rebuilding Europe. Something like $14 billion to get Western Europe rebuilt. The only catch is if you're going to take some money from us, you've got to be what? Of course, capitalist, okay? We want capitalism in the West. The GI Bill is something that we're going to use to get our young men who fought in World War II back home with either an education or a job, get them working again. And so it's like a sum of money to get people the skills that they need to transition back into the normal economic market. So we're talking 46 to 89, and we start with a couple of big theories. Number one is containment. The idea that communism is like a disease. Do not let it spread. Okay, it's based upon the Truman Doctrine, which says that we need to give economic aid to those who will remain capitalist. And so if we give money to people, they won't turn to those communist ways. Okay, kind of the way I describe it is like buying your friends in some ways. And the Domino Theory is an idea, especially that we looked at in Vietnam, but what's said that if one nation falls to communism, they all fall. Now, we've done this before. The Iron Curtain is a term described to the division between democracy in the West and capitalism, and then communism in the East, led by the USSR and, of course, the authoritarian Joseph Stalin. And the USSR basically has puppet states, or what we call satellite states. They are managed by Joseph Stalin. He says that they had, official elections, but really he just picks who he wants to be in power and runs his system in that way. And the USSR is going to keep their troops in these nations because they're afraid that they'll go capitalism, and he doesn't want that. So we create two alliance systems, which, worked so well in World War I, right? The first side would be NATO, and NATO is a capitalist group of nations. And then on the other side would be the Warsaw Pact, and those are the Eastern Bloc countries. And they are, of course, communist. So if you look at this map, all the blue countries are going to be on one side, and then you've got the red countries, which, fight on the other side. And it's this alliance system that defines the world in many ways. And there are a few non-aligned states, states that don't choose sides, but otherwise, these are the two systems. So some events to know in the Cold War would be like the space race, and understand that when Sputnik was launched by the USSR, we came back, noticing that Yuri Gagarin is, getting into space and all that kind of, awesome stuff. Well, the United States is going to send Neil Armstrong to try to get onto the moon, and steps onto the moon in 1969. Okay. So let's talk about American culture in the 50s. And to do that, you've got to take a look at some photographs and just see that the typical 1950s family is, small house, a lot of kids, and we get a rebirth in the middle class. America is doing well economically. To get an image in your mind, think of The Outsiders, the attire that they're wearing, just that time period. If you've ever read The Outsiders, what a great book. It gives you an idea of the 50s. Here's a picture of the suburbs and the growth of them. So people are building homes, and you're right on top of each other, and everyone's got a similar style home. And there's a lot of conformity. That is, that everyone is similar to one another, and not as much diversity as one might think. The middle class is growing. They're smaller homes, they're outside of the city, and therefore there's going to be some commuting, which expands the automobile industry. The typical 1950s family, dad is going to go to work, mom's going to stay at home and raise the children, and families are going to increase in size. You get the baby boom generation, which will be retiring soon, and perhaps could put a stress on the Social Security system of FDR. Men are going to try to work at one place for 40 years. A lot of this is because they get a pension. A pension is something that you get when you retire from a company. They pay you even after you retire. And it's all different per every company, but the idea is if you're loyal to a company, they're going to reward you on the tail end. And the 50s generation is really cool because, number one, the children of the Depression become the 50s parents. So these are people who have been through the ringer. And they have values. They save their money. They are hardworking. They're super patriotic. Many of them served in World War II. And they did spoil their children. And I think a lot of that is they wanted to give their children what they never had. And so we talk about in class, whether that's something that's true today. And I think it's an interesting discussion. In the 50s, you get the term teenager. What does that mean? It's just a different childhood. These teenagers, they have money to spend. There's their own style of dress, a t-shirt and jeans, for example. New trend in the food industry. I'm talking fast food. A lot of these teenagers got their own car. They're listening to rock and roll music. And because they have their own cars, they're going out to McDonald's. They're getting that quick food, their quick meal. They're hanging out, and it's a different sort of culture. And the businesses market towards that culture because they recognize the kids have money to spend. And it goes down to like a level of like putting a toy inside a cereal box. So trying to get kids to spend their money or get their parents, to spend money on their kids. Super prosperous time. And as a result, you get a generational gap. One generation who has to work really hard and doesn't have a whole lot, and another generation who lives in an economic time of prosperity. And so I'm not sure that they understand the struggle quite like their parents do. So there's some positives, some cool stuff about the 50s. There's also some negatives. And you should know that during the 50s, you got a segregated America, okay? We're still in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, and that's a scary time. There's some nuclear fears, right? The idea that, the USSR could shoot a nuclear bomb at any time. People are building fallout shelters. You got communism abroad. Cuba is going to become communist, leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis. We'll talk about that briefly in a little bit. And you've even got something called McCarthyism, where people are blaming one another and saying you're a communist, and it creates what is called the Second Red Scare in American history. Here are some duck and cover drills there, some fallout shelters, and so we must understand why are people so afraid, and it goes to the Trinity Test. We talked about how many scientists in Global 2, we talked about how many scientists just quit on the spot, right? Said, I don't want anything to do with this horrible, horrible weapon. Well, some of those scientists went a step further, like Klaus Fuchs, for example, and he gave the secrets of the atomic bomb to the USSR, believing that he would create a balance of power in the world. And so here are the Rosenbergs, here is Klaus Fuchs, and together what they do is they give the secrets over to the Russians. So let's talk quickly about McCarthyism. Joseph McCarthy is a senator whom plays into the fears of the Cold War in many ways, and says that he has a list of known communists in the United States and begins shouting them out. He is part of this group called HUAC, the House of Un-American Activities Committee, and basically what they're trying to do is investigate any radical group or person inside America that could be fascist, socialist, communist. And really what they start to focus on is, of course, the communist element in America. And not to say that there wasn't, but I think what you start to get is that there are, maybe thousands of communists in America, and that this is a huge wave in trying to take over America. And that's really just yellow journalism part 2. It's a ton of exaggeration. The Hollywood 10 is an example where These filmmakers are accused of being communists. They deny it. They say we're not. But even though their reputation is tarnished and they end up being blacklisted, and it's just a really embarrassing moment in American history where it's like Salem witch trials, but I mean it's the 1950s, so it's the modern witch trials, and all of this just sort of plays into the fears of Americans. So these guys lose a year of their lives in jail, and eventually what's going to happen to the McCarthyism is that people are going to get sick of it. It's like the boy who cried wolf, again and again his findings are wrong. People are not actually communist, and eventually Judge McCarthy becomes like a fad of his day, like something that people do for a little while and then it goes away. And that's what McCarthyism does. But it ruins a lot of lives along the way, and people are denouncing their neighbors, just real nasty kind of stuff going on. I wanted to talk to you about, during the 50s, what's going on in the backdrop. So if McCarthyism's the home front, well, in Korea, we see like communism really being combated. The containment theory actually existing, the domino theory in the back of people's minds. And so it all comes down to this, the Korean War from 50 to 53. And I have students, do a map quiz where essentially we talk through the Korean War. And I think that if you can do this here, you can get a 100. Can you tell me that communism and Kim Il-sung and Pyongyang are in the north, that the DMZ separates the two countries, even to this very day, and that democracy, capitalism, Sigmund Rhee and Seoul are in the south. And there's an S for Seoul, there's an S for Sigmund Rhee, so that should help you out. Today there's a division along the 38th parallel. The country signed an armistice. But to tell you a little bit about this, I'm going to kind of make this map a little crazy for a second. So let me get to drawing. Here we go. The way that it worked was that in the north, Kim Il-sung was supported by the Soviets, and the Soviets had come down to this 38th parallel, and the United States had actually come up from the south and met at the 38th parallel, and they kind of decided, like, listen, we're going to keep this nation separated, we're going to split it 50-50, kind of like what they were trying to do at Yalta or Potsdam in World War II, figure out a way to make the Soviets happy. And the Korean people at this time had been brutalized by the Japanese, and they were just sort of being tired of having an occupying force. And so Kim Il-sung, along with the Soviets, decided, we were going to work together, and it's a proxy war, so the Soviets really don't try to get their soldiers on the ground, but the supplies nonetheless. And the Chinese forces, who are led by Mao Zedong, who is also a communist, decide to help out Kim Il-sung, and Kim Il-sung and his band of communists start their march, and they eventually invade across the 38th parallel. And they capture Seoul, and they push all the way down, and really force the South Korean forces back. So to give you an idea of where Seoul is, I'm just going to mark a little green mark here. Somewhere about here would be Seoul, and so that's the capital city. And the South Korean forces end up being trapped in this little area here, in this little teal line called Busan. And so they are trapped in Busan. They are having a difficult time. And down here is like Japan, down in this area, down at the bottom here. And we, seeing that, South Korea has been invaded, that communism is spreading, oh my gosh, containment, what we do is we send General Douglas MacArthur to this little area in the southeast corner here. Trying to spell here. This area known as Busan. Okay, so this little area here is known as Busan. It's the Busan perimeter. And so we send Douglas MacArthur, who has won the war over in Japan and is quite the general and master of war in some ways. He comes over and he says, oh my gosh, look at all of these supply lines that they have running down. He says, well, I'm not going to fight them straight up. I'm going to use my naval advantage. And so he takes his forces and he uses a naval strategy. And we call that naval strategy Operation Chromite. And he takes his forces and he goes right into this little channel here. It's called Incheon. And he goes right into Incheon, lands here, and then takes his forces and just cuts right through. Just cuts right through. And all of these forces are now, no weapons, right? All of those forces, no weapons. And now, this is Douglas MacArthur, right? So is he going to just stop after capturing Seoul back? No, of course not. And so he lines up and begins to invade to the north, invading over the 38th parallel. And he invades up, and he is doing what he does. He is winning wars. And so he pushes up, to this northern boundary. And the northern boundary here is, shared with China, right? So if you are wondering what nation's up here, this is China. This is Mao Zedong territory, the evil librarian, right? And, he's pushing up into China. And he sees that the Chinese have something like, 100,000 maybe forces of soldiers, and he is angry. So with all of this, chaos, he decides that he is going to call up President Truman. And President Truman says, what do you need, MacArthur? And MacArthur says, I am going to use the atomic bomb. Well, that's not usually a way to talk to the President of the United States. You don't say, I am going to use the atomic bomb. And he said he was going to use it not just on North Korea, but on China as well, starting this nuclear chaos. And so Truman says, no, you need to leave after winning all this territory. You need to leave. And recalls MacArthur as he's being pushed back to Seoul, And so what happens is the combined forces of some of those Chinese and those North Korean forces push back down after being pushed back up. And MacArthur's forces now get pushed back, and they end up right back where they started at this line called the DMZ. And the two sides agree to an armistice, just a ceasefire, basically saying, this is the line that we are going to draw. And to this very day, they still are a divided country. To this very day, they are technically in a state of war. They do not necessarily like each other. In 2018, they did meet and, shake hands and exchange smiles. But to this moment, we are still locked in a gridlock of sorts. And the North Koreans believe that we eat pigeons and live in refugee camps. There's a lot of propaganda surrounding that. And so this is the situation of the Korean War moving forward. And by the way, that was really fast and just really quick, but I think it'll help you get the essential idea. And you could always watch my Global 2 videos on the Korean War, and maybe I'll go a little slower there. So what do we need to know about the war in Korea? Well, number one, know it's called the Forgotten War. People just don't have any idea about it. And as a result, I think we have a really poor understanding of what's going on today. So we don't understand why it's split, or why there's an armistice, or why they're building these military bunkers against one another. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Or now you kind of can understand why North Korea may not like America as much, because of the support we gave to South Korea in their civil war. It's the first war where the United Nations was used, so, with the military force. So, MacArthur did take a leadership role, but just know that it wasn't just us. It was a coalition group to try to stop the spread of communism. So just keep those things in mind going forward. MacArthur's relieved of this duty. I think that's an important thing to understand, that checks and balances really takes some work here in maintaining. So, and during the war, just know that we have a command economy to mold. So if ever the Regents ask you, during time of war, what happens to federal power over the economy, just know that it increases, and that's a fairly safe answer to give on any multiple choice Regents question. Let's talk about Vietnam, another country who shows the containment theory, domino theory in reality. And I'm going to go through this rather quick again, and there's a really great documentary series by Ken Burns that will give you, all the information you ever want to know about Vietnam. And during class, we watched some of these pieces to help you out with visualization of the Vietnam conflict. But suffice it to say, I don't have as much time to do it, so let's hit the high marks here. Number one, domino theory. That's like our key reason for why we need to be involved in Vietnam, because we do not want it to spread to Laos or Cambodia or Thailand or Burma or any of the other nations. I make the argument that Ho Chi Minh could have potentially been satisfied at Versailles at the end of the First World War. He had talked with President Woodrow Wilson. Wilson refused to talk to him, and Ho Chi Minh had asked for American support against the French. He wanted the French out of his country because Vietnam had been controlled by France for an extended period of time. And because France is our ally, Woodrow Wilson really backed off on that, and I think he missed an opportunity to make a friend and perhaps avoid Vietnam as an entire struggle. And so Ho Chi Minh turns to the USSR when Wilson ignores him. And there's this narrative in history that Ho Chi Minh's this hardened communist, and I don't know, maybe he grew into something of a communist, but I think early in his life at least, and for most of the conflict, he was a nationalist. He wanted to unify his country first. I think communism was just a means to an end, to quote Machiavelli. What are some aspects of the Vietnam War? You should know that we engaged in seek and destroy missions using helicopters. This is a helicopter war. We use napalm to destroy the forest area. In addition, Agent Orange would be another way to attack the forest, and this is going to lead to birth defects that are long-lasting in Vietnam. It's a really sad feature of warfare that not only do we destroy the beautiful geography of Vietnam, but then we leave these lasting impacts upon the people, and I think that's important to understand in terms of human rights. Other vocab to understand would be the Vietcong, also known as Charlie, if you've ever seen Forrest Gump, right? Or the VC, and they were infamous for their tunneling and, of course, their guerrilla warfare tactics. The tricky thing about the Vietcong is we don't know who they are. During the day they're farmers, and at night they're Vietcong guerrilla fighters. It's a very tricky war to fight because we're not fighting against just regulars. You're fighting against people who are chameleons in many ways. And an example of the turning point of this conflict would be using the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which went through Laos, which went through Cambodia, which really stifled us because when you fight a nation, you're really not supposed to fight in another nation's borders. Like, you're not supposed to fight Vietnam in Laos, right? You're supposed to fight Vietnam in Vietnam. So the tricky part is that we're trying to bomb the targets that are held by the Vietcong, and we end up bombing into Laos and Cambodia, and it's just this nasty moment in American history where our soldiers are over there, and we kind of call what amounts to a ceasefire. Like we say, we're not going to fight anymore. We're going to just, respect your holiday of Tet for a day. We're going to respect your culture, and Ho Chi Minh uses that as an opportunity and has a bunch of targeted attacks on the holiday of Tet, and they hit us in multiple directions in multiple spots, and what it does is it just flips this war on its side. Here's some examples of the tunneling. You can see like there's a bicycle at the bottom there for electricity so that they can run some power. You've got a kitchen. You've got a lot. They're living underground, and it makes it just so deadly. Here are some of the spike traps. They put feces on the ends of the spike traps, so you would not only obviously hurt yourself and impale yourself, but then you would get some sort of awful disease as a result as well, or get infected. Some nasty stuff. So here's some documentaries that I show my students, just clips, not the whole thing, right? You gotta use them sparingly, but really good stuff. Protest. Our Americans at home are going to protest this war, and it has to do with horrific events like the My Lai massacre, where we see pictures of men, women, and then children, even babies being killed by soldiers, American soldiers, and it's just like, what's going on over there? We need to take our young men back home. And some of that protest even went negatively towards the soldiers, and people call the soldiers baby killers, and it's this really horrible time for division amongst Americans. If the 50s, you're talking about positive economic growth. In the 60s, you get this real backlash, and sense of patriotism is really fading. And you can argue that, by the way. I'm not trying to say that whatever our soldiers do is right. I'm just saying that there's a lot more protest in America during the 60s than in the 50s. A lot of this has to do with the civil rights movement being concurrent, so it's not just like the hippie movement that's protesting. It's also African Americans that are out there protesting, and Muhammad Ali is saying, why am I gonna go after these Vietnamese when you can't treat me like a human being over in Louisiana? Why would I do that? I want my rights. I want equality. And if I'm treated as an equal person, then maybe I would fight for my country. And so you get a lot of this, backlash in America. We even have some anarchist elements. Remember and recall that we have had a president who was assassinated by Leon Solgatz, right? An anarchist, and William McKinley. So it's not like, whoa, anarchism, I've never heard of that before. You should have heard of it. And the Weathermen would be an example of that, where they're going out there and they're bombing places and using violence to protest Vietnam, which is a lot of irony there, huh? So this all comes to a headway with Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Johnson takes over after Kennedy is assassinated in '63. And Lyndon Baines Johnson is the president during a really, really awful time where the Pentagon Papers come out. And essentially what the Pentagon Papers say is that we were going to support France in taking back Vietnam. That we wanted to give Vietnam to France, our ally. That there were plans and preparations to go to Vietnam before the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where some Vietnamese soldiers apparently fired on a big battleship that we had, and we felt like that was provocation for war and sent our troops in. Well, there was sort of like this idea that maybe we were going to find a way to go to war, regardless of what happened. And the Gulf of Tonkin incident is just the thing that got us there. We knew casualties were going to be high. Maybe that sounds like common sense, but they tried to sell it as they were not going to be. They often use body counts as a way to exaggerate the amount of people we were killing over in Vietnam to make it look like we were really winning or something. But repeatedly we find that we have politicians that have been lying about the success of the war. We were losing, and yet we report that we are winning. Every day, every week, we're reporting that we're winning. And so when we find out that protesters were right, that this war needs to end, and that we're not really winning, and that our soldiers are not going to be home before Christmas, and that this war is just going to linger on, finally we're going to take our troops out of Vietnam. And when we do, Saigon falls, and Vietnam is one nation, a communist nation, but one nation today. So some effects. The War Powers Act of '73 says that the president, even using the idea of danger, cannot send troops over into combat unless they are granted permission from Congress. There's an idea that the president can do whatever he needs to do during a time of war through executive order, and this puts a check on that and saying, well, yes, you can defend, but you cannot attack, basically. You can defend our borders, but you cannot go out and attack another's borders without permission from Congress. Okay? The Voting Age Act, oh my gosh. The voting age was lowered to 18 through the 26th Amendment. Okay, let me say that again. So we can now vote at 18 because of the 26th Amendment. Okay. Other things. We talked about Vietnam falling. The big one, the one that I would like star and really know, is that the distrust of our government that exists even today, people not trusting our government, I think it really has roots in Vietnam. This Pentagon Papers stuff, it hurts the prestige of American government. The idea that the government voluntarily withholds a lot of information and things that we just don't hear about. Let's add fuel to that fire a little bit when we talk about public distrust of the government. Let's talk about John F. Kennedy and who he was and what happened and all that kind of stuff. So I will do this quickly because it's not ever going to pop up on our Regents, but I just think that there's some interesting features, and I'll just pull out a few of them. So John F. Kennedy was to go to Dallas, Texas to make an appearance because he had been supporting the Civil Rights Bill, and the South was really angry about that, and so he's trying to appeal to the Southerners and kind of get people back on his side. So he's going to take this tour, and as he's taking this tour, Abraham Zapruder is just a guy out there videotaping with his little camera, and he sees as 3 bullets were fired. That's the official from the Warren Commission, which we'll look into this later, from a Mannlicher Concarneau rifle, and this high-powered rifle fires 3 shots. First one misses, second one hits Kennedy, and then the third one hits him in his head, killing the president. And the Warren Commission looks into this and says it was Lee Harvey Oswald who fired these shots, and so he fired them from the Texas School Book Depository where he worked. He was a communist sympathizer. He had wanted to actually go over to the USSR and become an official citizen there, and so they say that he shot the president and that he fled. Afterward, he actually killed a police officer. We do know this to be true, and was later arrested. Well, once he was arrested, Jack Ruby killed Lee Harvey Oswald. And so there's a big conspiracy about why Jack Ruby would kill the assassin of the president. Jack Ruby was just a nightclub owner, though some people speculate that he had ties to the mafia and the mob. And so, did the mob try to silence Lee Harvey Oswald before he could testify and tell the world, if he actually did this or why he did this or anything that he knew? And we will never know, unfortunately. There's his open car where John F. Kennedy was shot, unfortunately. And there's Lee Harvey Oswald, who was later murdered by Jack Ruby 2 days later. And some people, say that Jack Ruby is someone who's a friend of the mob, so it really gets interesting and really gets difficult to speculate, why did he do this and all that kind of stuff. Elm Street's the turn where he made it. There's a magic bullet theory out there that says, how could this bullet have went through John F. Kennedy and then also went through Governor Conley, and they've actually found the bullet whole, which is really weird to me. So the bullet that went through 2 people is still whole. Whether you believe that or not, it's up to you. Some, crazy theories out there is that there's there was a guy with an umbrella and it wasn't raining, and so they say that perhaps this was a sign, that the umbrella man, as he is referred to, made a sign for the shot to be fired, that perhaps this umbrella is actually an umbrella gun that could shoot. That would explain some of the lacerations on John F. Kennedy, perhaps, that this umbrella gun has actually been worked on by the CIA and they had a final product for it, but that's a little bit one of those far-fetched ones. There's a lot of conspiracies out there. This one, again, a far-fetched one. I do it to make you smile a little bit in such a horrible and tragic moment in JFK's history. And so, election of John F. Kennedy. What do we need to know about? Number one, he was I don't want to say, hardened supporter of MLK, but certainly supported Dr. King. And he was going to try to make some changes to the Civil Rights Bill. He was sympathetic to the Civil Rights Movement in general. So was his brother. He was a Catholic, which is first time in American history, by the way. So we're moving up, right? We're getting to more of a diverse presidency. He's a young president. He also oversaw the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a failure, right? So good and bad. Establish a Peace Corps to help developing nations and get people working too, which is an underrated facet of the Peace Corps, right? You're getting these skills to go help out others, and as a result, getting our young people working. If ever there was a manifest destiny that went to space, this was it. The New Frontier program is the program designed to get our science program to defeat the Soviets in the so-called space race. And so this is the New Frontier program, what I would call manifest destiny to space. Here are some conspiracy theories. Again, you have to come to class to really get them all. There's so many, and I could spend way too much time talking about it. But just know a couple of things. Know that John F. Kennedy was more sympathetic to the civil rights movement, which I think we needed at the time in American history. And I think that that's a big takeaway. You should know about the New Frontier program and have an idea about the Peace Corps. By the way, just so you know, one of the most controversial parts of this whole thing is that Cynthia Nix Jackson, I believe it was her grandmother, if I'm not mistaken, had a film from an opposite angle. She gave it to the second commission after the Warren Commission, which was called the Commission on Assassinations, or the Committee on Assassinations, looking into Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination and also looking into John F. Kennedy's assassination for the second time, because they didn't really think that the story of having no conspiracy held water. And she her grandmother handed over this film to the Assassinations Committee, and it just went missing. So in many ways, it's something that always still bothers me. Like, where is that second film? We don't know, though. Now, talking about JFK and his work with civil rights leads me to a Supreme Court case called Brown v. Board of Education. And it's critical for your Regents exam to understand what Brown v. Board does, and I'm going to try to clear up any misconceptions about it. So number one, Brown v. Board of Education begins to and starts to end what we call de jure segregation. That means segregation by law. So lawful segregation is ruled illegal in America, and it's not like all segregation just ends at that point. No, it takes time, and they have to do complicated busing routes to basically bring whites and blacks together into one school. And of course, it's not a immediate fix, but we're getting better. So by Brown versus Board, finally we get some changes in American society in a positive way, going towards integration instead of segregation. However, as many scholars argue, that doesn't get rid of de facto segregation. That is, that people segregate on their own or by choice. That you would go to a school that has more white people in it because you want to, as opposed to going to a school that is mixed race. There are still people that would choose the former instead of the latter. So de facto segregation is segregation by choice. It's something that we're still trying to work through and develop, even to this very day, right, that we still have communities who are lack diversity and for a variety of reasons. So, but we're starting here with Brown versus Board. So Brown versus Board ends segregation by law, especially in American public school, and then bit by bit we're going to break down Jim Crow. Well, how do we get there? I mean, the Montgomery bus boycott of 55 and 56 is a moment where Rosa Parks just refuses. She says, I'm not going to give up my seat on the bus. She inspires others to not ride the bus until the bus companies will allow blacks and whites to sit equally on the bus, that blacks would not have to go to the back of the bus, that they could sit in the front. And so she inspires that, and she shows that through boycott, through not using a service, you can actually get political change, which is a pretty crucial element of the civil rights movement. Another example of this would be Ruby Bridges, who breaks that barrier in black and white education by being a young black girl to go to a all-white school. And what this photograph does not show you, it shows you the federal troops, but it does not show you that behind is all of the screaming and yelling of this white mob behind. And so, on the one hand, look how brave she is. On the other hand, just know that there was a lot of hate in America, and that this was not an easy thing to do, but an inspiring one at that. Other things that people did. The Freedom Rides of 61. Basically, white kids and black kids, college kids, maybe a little bit younger, but mostly college kids, got together on a bus, rode to the South, and when they got out of that bus for a little pit stop, what happened was a group of whites, they antagonized the mixed races on the bus, kids, and what happened eventually was a firebombing where they threw like Molotovs onto the bus and blew up everything. And it was just this really nasty moment where you saw the racism really at a fever pitch. And if you see any of the pictures surrounding the Freedom Riders, you'll see people being beaten and their faces really busted up, and it just really shows the hate. And what newspaper outlets did and media outlets is they filmed this stuff and showed this stuff to people and said, my gosh, look at how horrible the South it looks at this moment, and we need to fix it, we need to change it. So if you've got the ground force for the civil rights movement, then you also have to have the legal arm behind it, and that would be the NAACP. You have the sit-ins and the boycotts. Those grab the attention, but then you need to not only capitalize on that attention and highlight the white racism, and violence particularly. What you need to do is get it into the court system and get legal change. And so the NAACP will do test cases on civil rights issues to make sure that there is legal change in addition to all the suffering that people had to put into. And they are critical in making civil rights legislation pass. Now, the civil rights activists were known to go at places where they could really get the most headlines to show how bad the racism was in the South. And so they picked Birmingham. They went at Eugene Bull Connor, known for his temper. Dr. King knew this. Like, he was arrested in 63. He wrote the letters from a Birmingham jail. He knew Bill Connor. And so what he did is he organized and facilitated what we call the Children's Crusade. This march in which these kids walked out of school and said, we're going to demonstrate peacefully for our rights to fight against Jim Crow in the South. And what happened, of course, was that the police allowed dogs to go at kids. I'm talking children, okay? And this was a mostly children's-based movement. And so you got dogs, you got nightsticks. Imagine that, like kids being beaten by nightsticks. My gosh, firefighters turn the hoses on them. And I'm not talking your garden hose. I'm talking a fire truck hose. Imagine how hard that water pressure is. I mean, you're ripping skin apart. And so this movement, when people see this, they're like, what is going on in the South? We need to fix this. And the Children's Crusade is going to become a moment where it inspires people to march on Washington. And the March on Washington, the famous I Have a Dream speech, where he talks about, Martin does, he talks about the bringing together of the races, of little black children and little white children coming together and holding hands. This beauty that could be won through love, not through hate, not through violence, but through love. And he is doing this march to show his support for John F. Kennedy and the Civil Rights Bill, of course. And so this is a moment where there's a huge turning point in the civil rights movement. So what are some real changes? Number one, Voting Rights Act. Get rid of those awful literacy tests. You took one in class, right? They were designed to make you fail. Get rid of them. 2, Civil Rights Act of 64. Let's break down all those Jim Crow laws. And there are many, so it's going to take a long time for those Jim Crow laws to just get ripped apart bit by bit. But the Civil Rights Act says we're going to start it, and we're not going to stop until we get real change. 3rd would be affirmative action. Now, affirmative action on the one hand has its positives in people who support them, and then it's got its negatives in people who are against it. So on the one hand, people say, well, for hundreds of years, African Americans, minorities and whites, and women, minorities and women have been historically discriminated against. So what affirmative action does is it says, well, because of that, we recognize that the race is not being had equally. So what we're going to do is we're going to set aside certain positions, let's say in a corporation or in a public school system or in a college system. We're going to set aside certain spots for these people who have been historically disadvantaged, and we're going to give those spots to them because they need to catch up to the race that has been going on for hundreds of years. It's a way to sort of try at equality by giving the jump start to people who have been historically taken advantage of. On the other hand, other people say affirmative action is like reverse racism. The idea that you're going to penalize someone for being white and give certain abilities to African Americans, to Latinos, to women. And so it's a very highly debated topic. I won't do any more than that. Just know that it's debated and know what it does. It set aside certain spots. In best example would be like college for African Americans, minorities, women to be able to have the shot at going to college in a system that's historically been geared against them. The Fair Housing Act is another way that you go at that. And for a while, I'm going to say 100 years again, African Americans have not been given the same access to credit and the same access to loans that white people have been. And so what that does is it makes it harder for you to buy a house. You have to really have a larger chunk of money in order to get started on your loan if you're an African American person. What the Fair Housing Act does is it says, no, we need to give access to all people and have all people have access to credit so that they can buy houses. Why is that important? Well, if you have a house, you have a fortune that you're amassing, a personal fortune, you have an investment that you're amassing so that you can grow your wealth and eventually give that on to your kids or whatever you want to do. Okay? So Fair Housing Act gives some opportunities to people who have been historically discriminated against in loans and housing. So I've given you like sort of the MLK version of the civil rights movement. Your peaceful protest, your civil disobedience, breaking laws on purpose so that you can get change. There's the other side of this, which is Malcolm X. And I would be doing a disservice to you if I didn't tell you a little bit about his upbringing, because this is why he's more militant, perhaps, than others, okay? And also you should know Malcolm X at the end of his life is quite different from Malcolm X at the beginning of his life. So let's be clear on that, because a lot of people like to forget the end part. They like to just focus on the beginning to fit their narrative. So early in his life, and you can imagine why someone would be more militant if you had this guy's upbringing. He's born Malcolm Little. His home is burned down by the KKK as a child. His father has to, watch as his fortune and wealth are literally burned down because of white hatred, okay? His father is then murdered, and we can speculate why. We think the KKK, okay? So now it's just mom. Well, mom can't figure it out. Mom is having difficulty paying the bills, and she has to farm the kids out to the welfare system and give up her children, and then pretty soon she's institutionalized for quote-unquote being crazy, and therefore he's got no parents. He's separated from his siblings, and what do you think happens, right? He starts to turn to crime. He doesn't have a positive role model in his life. He's been really beaten up, I guess, in many ways. Quits school at the 8th grade. Yes, the 8th grade, okay? Not even high school, right? Middle school, he quits school. And lives the life on the streets. He's gambling. He's working for some of the biggest Caribbean dealers in the area, selling drugs, running numbers for people, that kind of stuff. And so it finally catches up to him. He actually tried to do a home burglary. He ends up getting caught, and the situation is that he's thrown into jail. Well, from Malcolm's perspective, he says this was probably the best thing for me. He says, because I finally woke up. I finally saw something different. What he did is he met and talked to and learned about a man by the name of Elijah Muhammad, who had been running the Islamic Party and wing in America at the time, which appealed to African Americans, appealed to Middle Easterners living in the country at the time. And he starts to pick up some of the teachings of Islam. And part of it is that he learned to love himself and love his history. He's remembering Mansa Musa of Africa, the most wealthy person that I've ever taught to you in history, right? He's learning about his history, how vibrant it is, how beautiful it is. And he's also, on the other side, flip side here, learning about the horrific treatment of African Americans throughout history. And I'm talking about the slave trade, right? The transatlantic slave trade. And he is pulling on those things. He changes his name to Malcolm X. He becomes radicalized. And he says, we are going to take the fight to them. And by them, I mean the whites. The way that I describe it to my students is, when Martin Luther King Jr. said, you got to turn the other cheek, Malcolm said, if they hit you, you pick up a brick and you hit them. You hit them 10 times harder. You push them into submission, right? So his vision of the country is, he said, I don't want integration. I don't want races coming together. He said, you don't like me, I don't like you. He said, but what I want is I want integration. I want our people to come together. Or black people to come together. And I want our institutions to be better than the whites, right? So he's arguing that we need to have segregation, but that his side of the coin, his African American side of the coin, right, is going to be better than the whites. That's what he believed. He said, if they're gonna come at me, I'm gonna come at them. And, famous quote, right? Revolutions are based on bloodshed. It sounds like akin to a Karl Marx, kind of thing. Not saying that he's communist. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that there's this sort of combative element to his movement. Now, the interesting thing that happens is that he's eventually assassinated by his own people. Whoa, right? His own people. So why is that? Well, slowly but surely, he started to have this epiphany. He went on something called a Hajj, part of your 5 pillars of Islam, right? Say, pray, give away, fast all day, go away, okay? So part of that Hajj is you've got to go out to Mecca. Well, he goes to Mecca, and guys, he sees there's white people out here, and they're Muslims, and they're good people. And he says, I got it wrong the whole time. I got it wrong the whole time. This movement could be stronger if we had, as Martin talked about, this beautiful coming together of races, that not all white people are evil, right? That there are some that are good, and that we need to make a movement coalesce together. Well, guess what? The Nation of Islam didn't want to hear that, and so they put a bullet in them. People forget about that end part. I hope you won't. Most people remember the early stuff about the lack of integration and the combat that he was talking about. But the end part, he had started to become something a little bit different, and I wonder what would have happened had he lived on. So there's Malcolm X. Now, when he passed, others took his torch, and I'm talking about Stokely Carmichael. And I'm going to get controversial here. Stokely Carmichael, who started with SNCC, which was boycotts, peaceful, right? Runs with John Lewis, who's a Congress member right now, okay? Very peaceful side. Stokely Carmichael didn't like that. He said, I can't do this. When they continue to meet me with violence, eventually I need to meet back with violence. He did not believe that whites could be a part of the movement for civil rights, that in fact they were the enemy. And he sort of becomes what Malcolm X was early in his life. He comes up with the slogan of Black Power, and he starts to talk about we're going to build up our institutions, just as Malcolm had thought about early in his life. Now, some say that's reverse racism, right? Because they meet you with racism does not mean that you become more racist, and that what they're asking for and what they're demanding is actually going to create more hate. I'm very, conflicted in this, and I think it demands more thought to really get to this debate. But the Black Power debate and the Black Panther movement, as we know it with Stokely Carmichael, it did have this ethos to it. They really did believe that they could uplift their people. I'm not talking about just politically, but I'm also talking about economically. One of the key reasons why we have free lunch at school, why we have that, is because of the Black Panthers, that they believed that they needed to feed their kids to get them to go into school so they could get an education, so they could move up in society. So there were nice elements to that. There's also this militant part of it too, that they were always armed and they dressed differently and acted differently, right? And they didn't want whites involved, and they all black neighborhoods, okay? So eventually what happens to these Black Panthers is that bit by bit, the federal government's like afraid. This is a militant movement within this country, and some of them were on the socialist dare I say, communist side of things. And if you've been listening to me at all with the Second Red Scare, you know how scared we were of communism and socialism. So one by one, the federal government's going to put up surveillance, and then one by one, in sting operations, these Black Panthers are going to be killed, murdered one by one. Now, of course, there's going to be justifications for it. And, they had guns, they had drugs, they had this, they had that. Again, you could teach a whole class on just this, okay? But point is that one by one, these Black Panthers go, and they are eliminated. And it demands further study. It would make for a great argument paper, wouldn't it? Okay. Here's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to finish up pretty quick because we're going on to an hour here. The presidents. I've basically got to do as best as I really can, try to get through from Nixon through Obama, and we'll throw in Donald Trump at the end to sort of coalesce together and get these last couple presidents. What did they do? I'm going to hit you with positives and negatives. I'm going to try not to lean one side or the other. I don't think that's my role for you. I'm going to try to give you the knowledge. It'll be tough when we talk about the Electoral College, but we'll do it. We're going to try to give you as unbiased as I can look at these presidents, and then you can make your decisions and look more into these guys. So let's start. LBJ, 36th president. LBJ is known for his Great Society program. This is a moment where he decides we're going to wage a war on poverty, okay? We're going to increase the role of the federal government, guys. That's the multiple choice on the regents, okay? So we are going to expand programs like Medicare, getting the elderly in our society taken care of in their health insurance, okay? We are going to try our best to improve the amount of spending that we put on programs to feed the poor. And that's really where he was coming from. He said, we have this great country. Why can't we help the poorest of the poor get up to the level where we're not in like developing country territory or something? We want to raise people up. Now, you know this if you've been listening. He's super, super unpopular towards the end of his presidency because of that thing called the Pentagon Papers, which said we were winning the war when we really weren't, and the public distrust came out. Okay. So that's LBJ. Pentagon Papers, Great Society, those should be the things that lock in your brain when we talk about him. Richard Nixon. You should look up his nickname if you want to laugh, okay? He is, on the one hand, popular for détente or détente. Say it however you want, okay? But I'll say détente because I've been to France once. And what he believes in and what he tries to do is limit the tension in the Cold War. Well, why is that a good idea? Well, because they have nuclear weapons, right? So he negotiates SALT, and SALT is a treaty that reduces the amount of nukes that everyone has. Why is that good? Well, if you have a lot of nukes, right, you're more likely to use them. If you have less, then maybe you're more likely to have some diplomacy. And remember, they opened up the hotlines. There was a direct line from Moscow to Washington, D.C. during JFK's presidency because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So now you've got this building, right? More diplomacy. Talk it out, guys. And he even visits communist China, which is like, whoa, this huge moment where he's like, meeting evil librarian Mao Zedong, all that kind of cool stuff. So he's trying to his best way, soften up the Cold War. However, if you know about Nixon, then you know a little bit about Watergate. There's my Pinocchio reference, right? So somebody breaks into the Democratic National Committee headquarters. Somebody, okay? Nixon is suspected that Nixon orchestrates this thing, puts people in to go after the Democrats. Him being a Republican, right? He wants to know was some dirt going on with the DNC. That's fine. That's what communist countries do, not democratic countries do, right? And we have a reporter from the Washington Post who has this mysterious informant called Deep Throat, who basically has some information that Nixon knew all about it, and that there are tapes talking about this. And so what happens? Well, everyone goes crazy. There's a Supreme Court case, Nixon versus the United States, which basically comes up with this idea. Because Nixon says, I don't got to say anything about this. This is executive privilege. I, as the executive branch, as the President of the United States, have access to a lot of information. And there's just some things that I can't tell the public. I can't tell the public about the nuclear launch codes. I can't, right? And this is an example where I have certain information and I just cannot release it to you. I was like, okay, well, let's find out if that's constitutional. So he tries to use the executive privilege so that the courts cannot look into Watergate, which in itself sounds very suspicious. And after the case, what they come up with is they said, listen, you're right, there are certain things that are executive privilege. This is not one of them. You are not above the law, meaning we can investigate the president, right? We have the ability to do that. Just because you're president of the United States doesn't mean you are king of the United States. It's two different things. And you're subject to the law just as the people are subject to the law. Now, that's the Supreme Court decision. You, in your life, will have to wonder and figure out, does this actually happen in practice? Is this just theory? Is this practice? What is it? But Nixon versus the United States, it'll be on your Regents exam, and basically it says executive privilege is not a reason to say that the president is above the law. The president is not above the law. Okay? Know it. Now, interesting that President Nixon, after being hounded during the Watergate scandal, resigns. And he's the only president to do so. He gives up his power. He, in some ways, abdicates, right? And is pardoned by Gerald Ford, a president coming later, who says, we'll forgive Nixon even if he didn't do anything, or if he did, we're pardoning it, we're moving past it, is essentially what President Ford says. Now, you can say that he did that for the betterment of the country, to let the country move forward. You can say that he also did that because he didn't want to get caught. And that is up to you and your political affiliations and your mindset, but that's what happened, okay? So Nixon versus the United States, critical case to know. We'll skip that for now. Okay, other Supreme Court cases that happened in the 60s and 70s. Kind of important. Gideon versus Wainwright would be one where if you are convicted of, if you're accused of a crime, then you have the ability to have an attorney. Anybody who is, up for, they say you did a crime, right? You have the right to defend yourself with an attorney, what we call a public defender. Now that's a really good thing, right? Everyone's got access to a public defender. Thing is these public defenders are often overworked, and these public defenders, sometimes are young in their careers, and therefore, are you getting the best legal advice? If we're being practical, probably not, okay? So Gideon versus Wainwright pushes us in the right direction. Maybe we've still got some ways to go. You should know Miranda versus Arizona because you've watched Cops, right? You're an American. So, Cops, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say or can and will be used against you in the court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you can't afford one will be provided for you. Okay, so those Miranda rights that cops have to give you, it comes from Miranda versus Arizona, a Supreme Court case. They do not come from the television show Cops, contrary to popular belief. Okay, Miranda versus Arizona came first, then the TV show Cops came. Okay, moving on. You might not like this one, okay? Tinker versus Des Moines, New Jersey versus TLO. If you see any of these Supreme Court cases, they're kind of shouting out you, okay? When you're in school, your privacy rights, I don't want to say you give them up completely, because you don't, but you give up quite a bit. If you put something in your locker, know that we can search it, because you are on public grounds, right? You give up something to be here. So if you had something illegal that you didn't want to, have on you, you should leave it at home, okay? Because if you bring it here and we search, you now are held liable for that. So you can't just think, oh, well, you can't search me, you don't have a warrant. No, you give up that right when you come to school, okay? You give up the right of that warrant. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about what you bring into this school and what types of rights you give up when you're in a public setting. Because you do. When you go around the public, you start to give up certain rights. Okay? Another one that I won't say too much about is Roe v. Wade, and that's the Supreme Court decision that's often, in the media actually a lot, which says that women have the right to an abortion. That is a very debated topic. I'll have you write it down, and you can talk to your parents about that, okay? The only thing I will say is it is an extension of what we call the feminist movement in America, which is that feminism is the idea that women should have equal rights to men. It doesn't mean that women should have more rights than men. It means that women should have equal rights to men. That there should be some equality based on the sexes, and that they should have the same rights that men do. Okay, so that's where I think Roe v. Wade matters to us. The rest of it is for your parents to discuss. Good luck with that. All right, one land, two people. The Arab-Israeli conflict. I had you guys read a whole play last year about it, and about vultures and all that kind of stuff, to do a little allegory. It's probably the most complicated thing that I teach, like, in my entire curriculum setting from 9, 10, and 11. So I'm not going to try to summarize that, but suffice it to say that Israel is a piece of land that the Israelis, who are Jewish, right, believe is their land, given to them by the British after World War II and the United Nations and all that kind of stuff. And the Arabs believe that that land of Israel is actually Palestine, and it's their land, and they believe that it was given to them by the British, okay? And so these two groups of people believe that this one piece of land is theirs, and instead of, like, working together to, like, split it or something, they decide that they're going to try to kill one another and take the land. This brutal, nasty conflict that is the Arab-Israeli conflict. The United States has taken the side of Israel. However, there was a time when we actually believed in trying to broker peace between the two sides. Now, there's been some nastiness in the Middle East to make this very, very difficult. And guys, right now, there is conflict in this area of Israel. This is highly debated, highly pushed back and forth, and one of the more divisive issues in this country and abroad. So let's talk about when we were able to bring the two sides together. It is our peanut farmer, and if you know me, you know how much peanut butter is important to my lifeblood, okay? Jimmy Carter. And what he does is he brokers a peace deal between the Middle East, Egypt, Israel, called the Camp David Accords. Basically brings these sides together, says, you know, we should share the Suez Canal, which was a canal running near Egypt, to be able to move things like oil through, okay? And the idea is, you know, you've got to focus on getting this Middle East right, so that the rest of the world can, number one, keep their oil flowing, and number two, stop some of the religious wars going on in those nations, okay? So, President Jimmy Carter, Camp David Accords is about bringing peace to Israel between the Israelis and the Arabs. Other things, besides being a peanut farmer, okay? He was considered to be what we call a Washington outsider, someone who had no real political experience, okay? Wasn't like a senator for 20 years or something like that. And so, whether you were on the Democrat side or the Republican side kind of changed your view, but some people said that's really good, right? That means that he can have an outsider's perspective and not be a part of the machine. Other people said, well, you kind of need to know how the machine works in order to get things done. So, again, goods and bads to all this. There was the Iranian hostage crisis, where for 444 days, the Iranians, who were angry that we had tried to install a leader in their nation, basically took our people from our embassy and said, you're not going to back. And this is led by Ayatollah Khomeini, who has the Iranian Revolution from Global 2. Okay, he's very, like, fundamental Islam. I'm talking Sharia law, very old school, Muslim country. Like, you've got to be Muslim being in that country, okay? So, for 444 days, he took our guys. Now, why is that not so good? It makes us look weak, point blank. It makes us look like we don't know what we're doing, okay? And so from that perspective, Jimmy Carter is often criticized as being a quote-unquote bad president and a weak president for this incident. Now, if you've been listening to me, I hope that you've got a little bit more of a balance. Every president, there's good and bad to him, right? Good, you know, there's some give and take here. So, Americans felt like Carter was weak. They did not re-elect him. They elected instead President Ronald Reagan, shown there. And Ronald Reagan had this belief called supply-side economics, which is criticized as trickle-down economics. They are the same thing, okay? Supply-side economics is what the regents will say. If you're listening on like CNN, Fox News, etc., and they criticize supply-side economics, what you'll see them say is trickle-down, okay? Often supply-side is used by conservatives and Republicans, and then on the other side, trickle-down economics are words used by Democrats and people on the left, okay? Traditionally. I'm not saying always, but that's kind of how it goes. Supply-side economics, which we talked about during the Great Depression, right before it, right, where you had all those laissez-faire presidents. I'm talking about, mid-1920s, so Warren Jazz Hands Harding, Silent Calvin Coolidge, like those guys, okay? They believed in having lower tax rates on the top people, okay? So you top people, individuals, people who are, over $250,000 a year, okay? People who make millions, people who are big money, lower those taxes on them. Why do you do that? Well, they say that what will happen is those people on top will employ more people because, well, they got more money and they'll buy more stuff, right? And so they will stimulate the economy, and they will actually take the money that they're saving and spread it out through the economy better. And it's sort of this like purist laissez-faire idea that what will happen if you have more money is you'll have more people working for you, and that'll stimulate and move the economy better. Now, other people, right, the people who call it trickle-down, will say, well, if the business just makes more profits and they don't have to shell out as much in taxes, well, then what will happen is that they will stop passing down those profits. They'll just keep it for themselves, and instead of buying one yacht, they'll buy 2 yachts now. Thank you, right? So it all comes down to your personal philosophy and looking at it and thinking about it. There's 2 sides to the coin here. I'll show you some videos in class about that. But that's a critical element. Supply side economics. Cut the taxes for the wealthy. Okay. Other things he did. He relied on something called deficit spending. What could go wrong here? Basically, and we've always done this, so I'm not just criticizing Reagan, right? We've always done this, especially think about FDR, right? I mean, he had to do this ton, right? Deficit spending means that I spend money that I don't have yet, okay? The idea is that I'll spend this money and maybe I'll print it, maybe I'll borrow it, but I'll spend money I don't have so that I can keep my taxes lower. And if I keep my taxes lower, eventually the economy will spike, and then I can pay the money back. Problem is that if the economy doesn't spike, then you don't pay it back. Understand? Okay. So he also believes in something called New Federalism. So the way that it used to work, or the way that before Reagan, that people were doing things, is you would hand money to states for specific programs. I'm giving you $10 billion for Medicare. I'm giving you $5 billion for food stamps. I'm giving you a specific amount of money for a specific program. And if you don't use it all, then it comes back to me, okay, as a federal government. What he says is, why do we do that? Why do we stipulate this is for this and this is for that? It's too much work and it's not efficient. He says, instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a block grant. I'm going to give you, instead of giving you, X for this and Y for this and Z for this, I'm just going to give you a lump sum. I'm going to give you $25 billion, right? You, as a state, disperse that however you need to disperse it. You need to, every state will be different. I'm going to give you a block sum of money. You, as governor of your state, figure out where it goes. And I think in some ways what that does is it puts the onus on states to figure out what do the people need in my state and then put the money where I need it most. So some states might need it more for road building. Other states might need it for education. Some states might need it for medical expenses. You figure out what you need it for and you use it. It's called New Federalism. Okay? Pretty cool. Foreign policy. He really believed in staying out of foreign affairs. Reminds you of that George Washington, right? Farewell address kind of stuff. He's also president during the fall of the Berlin Wall and gets a lot of credit for that. Now, you can always speculate, well, how much of it was him? How much of it was Nixon earlier in the presidency? How much of it is just the Soviets realizing how bad Joseph Stalin was, And there's a lot to be said on those fronts. But he definitely was president during the Berlin Wall fall. He also said, we need to go back to the Roosevelt Corollary. We need to go back to the Monroe Doctrine, where America has a huge role in Latin America. And he's going to get himself in some dust-ups, and some nasty stuff's going to go on between Iran and what he's going to do with the Nicaraguans, okay? It's called the Iran-Contra affair. It's this moment where basically he arms a certain side, a side that did not believe in communism, and to do that, he actually is going to use some money that he gives to the Iranians, and it's this way of getting around Congress. The Iran-Contra affair, I don't really have time to go through it, but essentially people say that he used money unfairly to help overthrow a movement down in Nicaragua. We're very, very embedded in what's going on in Latin America throughout the 1980s as a result. Now, when we leave Latin America, we go to George H.W. Bush, the first Bush. We get involved in the Middle East again, but not in a good way, okay? We're going Persian Gulf War. Basically, Saddam Hussein tries to take over Kuwait, and we ain't having that. Saddam Hussein, known as a dictator, Saddam Hussein goes after his own people, the Kurds, and so we send in soldiers, and we defeat Saddam. Thing is we allow him to stay in power. And because of that, we're highly criticized. However, Saddam will give us control of the oil fields to us and our allies. Kuwait's independent, so we get everything we want and we get the oil, but Saddam has to stay in power. And remember, Saddam is like killing his own people. So, why were we there? Were we there for the human rights violation? Were we there for the oil? I'll let you decide, okay? After H.W. comes Bill Clinton. You all know about the Monica Lewinsky scandal. If you don't, talk to your parents, okay? But here's what he tries to do. He builds on Jimmy Carter. He builds on that idea of peace to the Middle East. Like how, right? So he's going to try to work on trade and facilitate trade deals so that the Middle East is happy, it's economically sound, and we experience quite an economic rejuvenation as part of Bill Clinton's presidency. However, he's impeached like Andrew Johnson, not actually convicted. Impeachment does not mean convicted, right? It just means you're going on trial. And he's going on trial for the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Again, I should put some asterisks next to that. Talk to your parents, okay? And remember, Andrew Johnson, just so you know, came in after Lincoln was assassinated and was criticized because he fired Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and put Ulysses S. Grant in charge. Now, why is that important? Well, Congress wanted Stanton, Johnson wanted Grant. So it's this power struggle, and you should ask the Senate before you fire someone that, let's face it, Stanton was chosen by Lincoln, and he was not chosen by Johnson. So it felt like he was just kind of doing a little bit of what we call like nepotism, hiring people that he likes, going back to like spoil system of Andrew Jackson. Now, right now, doesn't sound like a big deal, but you should just know that he was impeached and just hark back to Andrew Johnson. So, what else does Clinton do? NAFTA. Now, NAFTA's been ripped up from the Trump presidency, but you should just have an idea of what it used to be. It used to be that they lifted all the tariffs on Canada and Mexico so that there was free trade going on between America, Canada, and Mexico. So that, trade could be facilitated. There's no taxes on those foreign goods because they're not treated as foreign. It's kind of like you're all on the same team and we're all kind of part of the same sphere. So our goods can be moved quicker and easier and efficient. And the idea behind NAFTA was they could really reduce the cost of goods for Americans. Problem is that it did a lot of bad stuff for the unions over in America who are making goods over here because now you got to compete with cheap Mexican and Canadian labor. So that makes it kind of tricky. So good and bad, right? All right. What about George Bush? Not sure if you know about or remember any of this kind of stuff, but I do. And this was a highly controversial moment because George Bush did not win the popular vote against Al Gore. Okay? He did not. And to top it off, in Florida, it looked like Al Gore had won the vote in Florida. And it was very close, though. So they did a recount. And after the recount, it turns out that in the same state where Jeb Bush is governor, okay, brother to George Bush, in the same state of Florida where his brother is governor, it just so happens that the polls flip back and Al Gore loses Florida after the recount. And that was enough to put George Bush over the top. So some people say that that election, may not have been exactly the most democratic one. Some people also say that they just needed the recount and that history happened and stop being whiny crybaby losers. So, again, very, very controversial. And it's a moment in history where Al Gore literally, he won the popular vote. More Americans voted for him. But remember, that doesn't matter. It's the Electoral College that matters. So George Bush got more electoral votes, and as a result, he won the presidency. Okay? He is president during the 9/11 terrorist attacks. He takes the country to war against Iraq for weapons of mass destruction that were never found. He also passes something called the Patriot Act, which limits your freedom during war. Think building on Schenck versus the United States. Okay? And that allows the government, going further, to engage in surveillance. They can look at your emails. They can look at your phone records. They can do what they need to do for the protection and safety of America, is like the language. For our safety, we give up these rights to the government. The government can check in on us whenever they so deem it, and it's up to their judgment. It's a lot of power put in the hands of the federal government. And again, highly criticized both ways. Some say, no, I'll give up those liberties for protection. Other people say, no, those are my rights. How dare you? So, again, very tricky. And he also builds on that trickle-down economics theory of Reagan by giving those cuts to the wealthy. All right. President Barack Obama, we're almost there. Let's go at President Obama here from 2009 to 2017. Boom, here we go. First African-American president. You already knew that. Great Recession of 2007. This is where that housing market bubble burst. Basically what happened was they were giving out too many loans easily to people who really weren't qualified. They were just kind of handing them out. And the restrictions were really, really lax. And what happened was people couldn't afford the mortgages that they were being given. And then when their home values went down, it was even worse. And so caused the Great Recession. He actually gave out a stimulus check to individuals to get the economy going again, just like a lump sum of money to get people spending money again. He was highly criticized because he bailed out the big companies that had actually went bankrupt. He gave money to keep them alive. Some people say, no, that's really good. You needed to save them. Other people say, no, let them fail and see what happens next. Again, highly criticized. He also passed the Affordable Care Act, which might be the most criticized of all things that I've been talking about lately, which is that all people have the right to health care. And the problem is that this has been a situation where Republicans have really fought against it, and so some of the reforms of the Affordable Health Care Act are not maybe the best for everybody. Some of the costs have gotten too high because of some of the compromises that have been made, and so you've got to look at it, and I think this is one of the bigger issues that our election will need to discuss and talk about in the next election. So huge. Here's the deal with healthcare. It says that all citizens must have it. If you don't, then you pay a penalty. So you start thinking about, is that right? Do we penalize people who don't have healthcare? Do we do that because we need everyone on the system for the system to work? Is that right? I don't know. Okay. Last president will be President Donald J. Trump. I could put more on here now that recent events have come on, but I think that we still need to allow for some digestion of some of the things going on. So just easy things that you should know about. Make America Great Again is the slogan that he used to mass the people. He ran as a Washington outsider, reminds you of Jimmy Carter, talked about draining the swamp, talked about putting people in positions where they had real experience in the field that they were running in. Okay? He decides to cut taxes, and does. Now, you can argue where the tax cuts were, more on the wealthy. Again, that's that trickle-down or supply-side economics angle that Republicans have been using for a while. So, sort of falling in line with those guys. And his criticism is using Twitter and all the things that he says on there. He believes that it's really good for the people to hear his thoughts and get instant access to the presidency. Other people say, no, that's going too far, and so you have to make those decisions on your own. Point is that I've taken you from 1950 to the present day. Thank you for listening. This is the longest screencast I think I've ever done. Hope it helps. Hope you guys are ready for the Regents. Do all your packets, do all your work, and we'll be in really good shape for the U.S. History Regents so we can destroy this thing. Okay? Have a great day, guys.